This video is brought to you by
Cool green clothing coming straight up out of that DMV. You know what it is. This that Baltimore designer right here. Come on now, come and show some love and show some support. Go online right now, coolgreenclothing.com, and make your purchase. Oh yeah, by the way, if you ain't cool and getting the green, you're in the way, and that's just basic.
It's your girl, Mrs. Tony 2 times, and I'm back with another episode of the Baltimore Way. In this video, I'll be taking it just 30 minutes north of Baltimore to Edgewood, Maryland, to discuss the fatal end to an on-again, off-again relationship that lasted 17 years between Tanasha Siena and George Moore Jr. But before we get into this video, please don't forget to hit the like button and make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any more stories like this or any future uploads. And of course, feel free to share this video with everyone you know. Also, if you'd like to see more episodes in the Baltimore Way series, please click the link to the playlist in the description box after this video to get caught up. All right, let's get right into it. Tanasha Siena was born in San Diego, California. She was a military kid and moved around quite a bit. While moving around caused some kids to struggle with making friends, Tanasha was the opposite and was very outgoing and made friends easily. After graduating from high school in 1997, Tanasha went on to attend Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina. During her freshman year, Tanasha would end up meeting and falling in love with a junior who attended North Carolina A&T right next to Bennett College. His name was George Moore Jr. 20-year-old George was 2 years older than Tanasha. He was very outgoing and intelligent. He majored in electrical engineering. George took his studies seriously and worked hard to support himself through college. Tanasha and George's relationship took a big step when George introduced Tanasha to his family. Then just 5 months after meeting, Tanasha moved in with George. In 1999, George and Tanasha welcomed their first son together. Tanasha stopped going to school and worked to support their child. George got another job on top of the job he already had to support their son and continued going to school. Around this time, the relationship between Tanasha and George was hitting a rough patch. George graduated from North Carolina A&T in 2001 with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. George had multiple job offers, but ultimately accepted an offer from NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. By that time, George and Tanasha were seeing other people. He moved from North Carolina to suburban Baltimore to start his career. 3 months after the move, Tanasha went to Maryland to be with George. They got an apartment together in Laurel, Maryland. Just because George and Tanasha were living together in Maryland didn't mean he wanted to be exclusive with her. And with that, Tanasha decided to move on and moved to DC in 2008. She landed a sales job with AT&T where she made upwards of $80,000 to $90,000 a year. Now that Tanasha was able to support herself and her son, she didn't need monetary support from George. However, that didn't stop George from being an active father in their son's life. His son was the most important thing in his life. Tanasha appreciated George's dedication, and the two co-parented well for the most part. Although separated, Tanasha and George would hook up from time to time and sometimes go on dates together. One of those hookups led to the birth of their second son in 2010. After their second son was born, George invited Tanasha to live with him. They purchased a house together in Edgewood in 2011. Tanasha and George seemed to be working towards being a family with their 2 boys, but the reconciliation was anything but that. George and Tanasha slept in separate rooms in the home they shared together. They were not in a committed relationship. George would see other women, and Tanasha was free to see other people as well. Tanasha may have tried to be okay with the arrangement, but she would become extremely jealous when George met other women. Tanasha would do everything to sabotage George's relationships. She would vandalize his property, like keying his car or busting out his car windows. Despite all of that, George never spoke badly of Tanasha, and he never pressed charges. He focused on the good he saw in her. In 2014, the dynamics between George and Tanasha began to come to a head. In April of that year, George went on a cruise without Tanasha. George ended up meeting a woman on the cruise, and they formed a friendship that evolved into a romantic relationship. When George and his new woman got back to Maryland, they started spending lots of time together at her place and took trips to Atlantic City. Tanasha was livid that George had started spending all his time with his newfound love interest. She felt like too much of his time was taken up and he wasn't spending enough time with their boys. Tanasha blew up George's phone with calls and texts when he went to Atlantic City with his new girlfriend one weekend. In May 2014, Tanasha once again kept calling George while he was spending the night at his girlfriend's house. When George kept ignoring her, she drove to the girlfriend's place and demanded that George come out and talk to her. She kept pressing the buzzer to the building and yelling profanity, calling the woman out of her name. Tanasha kept saying she wanted to save her family. George finally came out and left in his car. George made it very clear to Tanasha that he had met his soulmate and that he was going to be with this woman and she would have to accept it. George and his new girlfriend had plans on getting married and building a life together. George was very much a giver and put himself last. He gave everyone the best while he would settle for purchasing his clothes from the thrift store. In this new relationship, George's girlfriend encouraged him and helped him to start investing in himself. George agreed to leave Tanasha the house and of course continue to take care of the boys. But Tanasha said she told George that she would take him to child support and move with the children to North Carolina. She claimed George didn't like that. Tanasha believed George agreed to their living arrangement to avoid paying child support and thought that's why he wouldn't really ever leave. But she saw that George was serious about his new relationship. Tanasha became enraged and drenched in jealousy. On June 2nd, 2014, at around 7 p.m., Tanasha had just come back from getting dinner with the kids. George came home and went upstairs to his room, where he would usually go lay down and rest before dinner. Tanasha told her teenage son to take his 3-year-old brother to the park and return in 30 to 40 minutes. The 14-year-old thought the time frame was odd because she never did that before. He was used to having to leave the room if his parents were going to argue, but never a time frame. The oldest son was about to leave the house when he doubled back to grab a piece of chicken they got for dinner. After he reached for the chicken, he heard pow pow. He grabbed his little brother and went to the park. As the teenager was about to return home, their neighbor stopped him and took him and his brother to their house instead. 911 received a call from Tanasha reporting an attack and a shooting. Tanasha said she shot the father of her child, George Moore Jr., and claimed self-defense. When Harford County law enforcement and EMTs arrived at the scene, they found Tanasha with injuries to her eye and the side of her face. George was found in his bedroom, wounded in the head, lying slightly face up, propped up on a pillow. He was pronounced gone on the scene. Tanasha was taken to the hospital to be treated for her minor injuries. She was released shortly after and was taken to the station for questioning. Tanasha told detectives that her and George got into an argument about the amount of time he was spending with his girlfriend and not enough for their boys. She told detectives that George got irate, came after her, and put his hands on her. She claimed her injuries were from George hitting her head against the dresser over and over again. She said when George stopped, she went towards the dresser drawer and grabbed a weapon and told George if he didn't stop treating her like that, she would use it. Tanasha told detectives that George wasn't fazed and threatened her and came after her once again, and that's when she fired at George. But when detectives had a chance to speak with Tanasha and George's oldest son, he told them he hadn't heard any argument prior to the shots. Detectives found that the home hadn't seemed to be in disarray more than it already was. Detectives began to doubt Tanasha's claims. She was subsequently arrested and charged with first-degree hit and weapons charges in connection to George's slaying. George's family couldn't believe that Tanasha would go this far and take George's life. The family took Tanasha in as one of their own. They said George never thought that Tanasha would hurt him and that George would never hurt Tanasha. George didn't believe in putting his hands on a woman. Detectives also interviewed people who knew George. They described Tanasha as crazy and obsessed with George. Colleagues of George spoke of an incident where Tanasha had wounded herself on the lip and told George she would call the police and say it was him if he didn't leave a bar with her. She didn't want him to be with anyone else. If she couldn't have him, no one could. They believed that Tanasha's motive was driven by jealousy that George was moving on and not self-defense. Tanasha went to trial in April 2015. The prosecution cast doubt on Tanasha's self-defense claims. They showed the jury the physical evidence that Tanasha's injuries may have been self-inflicted and that she had done it in the past. Several witnesses were called to the stand, including George's girlfriend, along with George and Tanasha's oldest son, who testified against his mother. Tanasha also took the stand in her own defense. She even demonstrated for the jury what took place the night George lost his life. With all the evidence and all the testimony, the jury deliberated and came back with a guilty verdict of second-degree hit and a weapon violation. Jurors didn't believe that George's slaying was premeditated, but also didn't believe Tanasha's claims of self-defense. She was sentenced to the max for both charges and received a total of 50 years in prison. Tanasha will be eligible for parole in 2040 when she is 60 years old. May George Moore continue to rest in peace. My belated condolences to his family. I send them my well wishes. And to George's and Tanasha's boys, I hope that they are well. Tanasha and George were off and on for 17 years. That's a long time. I believe that George was really just trying to do the right thing when it came to being a father. But unfortunately for Tanasha, George did not want to commit to her, and it seems like he was honest with her about that. and she seemed like she chose to accept the terms of their situation. But to me, it was under the guise that George would always come back to her and they would live happily ever after one day. Then when George told her he had found his soulmate and she had to accept that, I believe that is what caused Tanasha to snap. Imagine after all those years of her successfully sabotaging his other relationships. And now his new relationship was moving forward, whether she liked it or not. And then to fake her injuries, causing her self-harm, that's next level. It reminds me of the movie A Thin Line Between Love and Hate. Hell knows no fury like a woman scorned. Fam, tell me your thoughts and opinions on this tragic story in the comments below. Alright fam, that's it for this episode of the Baltimore Way. Thank you all so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is your girl, Mrs. Tony 2 times, and I'm out.